A few months ago, I watched the Netflix series Ripley, adapted from Patricia Highsmith's 1955 novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley. Highsmith's novel is the first in a series of 5 books centered around the title character, con artist Tom Ripley. I was, of course, aware of the source material before I watched the show, but it was still my first exposure to anything Tom Ripley related, and I really liked it. It's consistently gripping, the cast is great, and the black and white cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. Once I'd finished it, I decided to check out the 1999 film adaptation of the novel out of curiosity, and then I ended up buying and reading the original book. So yes, over the past couple of months you could say I've become quite well acquainted with Tom Ripley, and I became fascinated by how the movie and the show take their own approaches to adapting the story to the screen, while still managing to remain mostly faithful to the source material in their own ways. I also came to dislike Saltburn even more than I already did, now that I could see just how much of a lame ripoff it really is. But we won't be talking about that here, because there's already an excellent video essay by Broe Deschanel that covers that ground in depth. What I want to do in this video is take a closer look at the two adaptations, specifically how their distinct approaches to characterization allow them to stand on their own as unique entities even as they follow the same fundamental story beats. So here's a recap of The Talented Mr. Ripley's story. If you're unfamiliar with it, then I don't really know why you're watching this video, but I would advise you to click off anyway because of spoilers. So our main character is Tom Ripley, a down-at-heel con artist living in New York. One day, he's approached by Herbert Greenleaf, a shipping magnate who believes Tom to be a close friend of his son Dickie. Dickie's been living a carefree bohemian lifestyle in Italy for some time now, and Herbert offers to pay for Tom to go there and convince his son to return home. In Italy, Tom meets Dickie and his sort-of girlfriend Marge, and manages to worm his way into their social circle, becoming increasingly obsessed with Dickie as they spend more time together. Eventually, he crosses a line when Dickie catches Tom wearing his clothes and is understandably freaked out by this behavior. Realizing that Dickie is about to end their friendship but unwilling to give up the extravagant lifestyle he's become used to, Tom murders Dickie while on a boat ride with him in San Remo, then disposes of the body and scuttles the boat. He takes this opportunity to steal Dickie's identity and live off his trust fund in Rome, forging letters to Marge to make her think Dickie is alive but no longer cares about her. Everything seems to be going great for him until Dickie's friend Freddy Miles comes to Rome looking for Dickie and soon realizes that something is wrong. Tom kills Freddy and is eventually questioned about his death by the police, who of course believe him to be Dickie. Managing to escape suspicion, Tom resumes his original identity and moves to Venice, but is soon confronted by Marge as well as Dickie's father. Though they come close to discovering the truth, they are ultimately convinced that Dickie must have taken his own life, and Herbert gratefully bequeaths what would have been his son's inheritance to Tom. The story ends with Tom rich and having gotten off scot-free, though the threat of eventual exposure still hangs over him. The 1999 film, directed by Anthony Minghella and nominated for 4 Academy Awards, retains the novel's key plot points but makes a number of deviations from the source material, both obvious and subtle. This is not a complaint, to be clear. Contrary to popular belief, changes in adaptations are not an inherently bad thing, and fidelity is not necessarily an indicator of quality, but I still think it's worth mentioning given the subject of the video. The Netflix series, created by Zaillian, is overall more faithful to the book, but also has its own additions to the story that make it an interesting adaptation. I'm going to analyze how each adaptation approaches 4 of the story's key characters, and how the differences in characterization allow both versions to stand on their own. I should note that there is also a fairly loose French adaptation from the early 1960s called Purple Noon, but for the sake of simplicity, I just want to focus on these 2.
There's a bond between us. Can you understand that? Or are you just going to keep making accusations?
So let's begin with the talented Mr. Ripley himself. In Minghella's film, he's played by Matt Damon, and in the Netflix series by Andrew Scott. Right out of the gate, Minghella and Damon's version of Tom differs fairly heavily from Highsmith's character. In the book, Tom is already an experienced grifter by the time we meet him, scamming people not simply for profit, but sometimes just for the thrill of it. Movie Tom is far from an honest man himself. He willingly plays along when Dickie's parents mistake him for a classmate of their son's, introduces himself as Dickie to a stranger he meets en route to Italy, and brags about his talents for forgery and impersonation, but we don't really get the sense that he's regularly running tax scams on unsuspecting victims like we do in the book. Damon portrays Tom as awkward and dorky, but with a sort of innocent, boyish charm that endears him to most people he meets. Certainly not the kind of person you're expecting to be capable of murder. And so, the movie's depiction of his and Dickie's fateful boat ride plays out quite differently from the source material. In the book, Tom deduces on the journey to San Remo that Dickie has grown tired of him and formulates a plan to kill him and steal his identity before they're even out to sea, simply waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. In the movie, a heated altercation breaks out between the 2 of them at sea, eventually causing Tom to snap and hit Dickie with an oar. Since he's shown no inclination towards violent behavior prior to this moment, he's as shocked as the audience when he does this and tries to apologize. However, the enraged Dickie then attacks him, resulting in Tom killing Dickie in self-defense. It's portrayed as a crime of passion, a spur-of-the-moment expression of anger and hurt that sends Tom hurtling down a path that he has no choice but to go further down. Like in the book, Tom covers up his crime and steals Dickie's identity, but it's not as if this was something he'd actively been planning to do. It's just that he's already done something he can't take back, so he may as well make the best of it, so to speak, by using it as an opportunity to live out his fantasy of being Dickie Greenleaf. Everything Tom does from this point on, including the subsequent murder of Freddy, once again depicted here as an act born out of in-the-moment panic, is part of his efforts to cover up the increasing trail of lies left in his wake as a result of the one fateful moment on the boat. In essence, Damon's Tom is a compulsive liar, but still a relatively normal young man who becomes increasingly manipulative and unstable as he gets further and further in over his head. This is pretty different from Highsmith's Tom, an outwardly charming but amoral sociopath who is already having violent fantasies about Dickie killing Marge when he becomes jealous of her close relationship with him, even before he murders Dickie himself. While Andrew Scott is about 20 years older than Highsmith describes the character as being, his take on the character is a little closer overall to the book's characterization. As in the novel, the show establishes that Tom is a con man making a living from scam to scam in New York, constantly in a state of paranoia about being caught. However, Scott also portrays him as being less outwardly charming than the character in the book, let alone Damon's portrayal. In fact, the performance it reminded me of the most was Jake Gyllenhaal in Nightcrawler. Both of these characters often give the vibe of an alien unsuccessfully trying to blend in among humans. And this isn't a problem at all. I think Scott's performance is a brilliantly unsettling one that you can't take your eyes off of no matter how skin-crawling he can be, and the fact that he gives off this weird alien vibe only serves to underscore the inherent loneliness of the character. As such, the scene on the boat plays out differently as well. This version also features a dialogue exchange between Tom and Dickie in which Dickie confirms his desire to distance himself from Tom prior to Tom killing him, but it's much less heated and more passive-aggressive than in the film. Again, when Tom kills Dickie in the movie, it's an act of passion. But in the show, even though we don't see him planning it ahead of time like we do in the book, it feels like a much more calculated choice. We haven't seen any evidence that Tom has killed anyone prior to this, but he definitely feels like somebody who isn't above murder. There's almost a look of resignation on Tom's face when he looks down at the oar before he picks it up and uses it to hit Dickie. Like he hadn't necessarily wanted it to come to this, but he knows what he has to do if he's going to keep up his new lifestyle. A similar contrast can be found in the scene where he murders Freddy. Damon's Tom is in a state of frenzied panic as he hits him over the head, much like his book counterpart, who mentally questions whether this is the best course of action to take, but knows he has no time to come up with an alternative. Scott's Tom, on the other hand, remains outwardly calm the entire time. When Freddy leaves to call the police, Tom simply picks up an ashtray and attacks him without a second thought. Once again, we get the sense that this Ripley has no qualms about violence whatsoever, so long as it's in the interest of self-preservation. Another key difference between Damon and Scott's portrayals that makes Scott a little closer to Highsmith's version of the character is the question of his sexuality. In the book and Netflix series, there are unmistakable queer undertones to Tom's obsession with Dickie, but it's not explicitly stated whether his feelings towards him are indeed sexual or even romantic in nature. Highsmith always preferred to describe him as having no real sexuality, and in both versions he emphatically denies being queer when confronted about it, albeit not too convincingly.
I like girls.
However, the movie throws all ambiguity out the window with regards to this specific element. It's very clear about the fact that Tom is, on some level, attracted to Dickie, and this is part of the reason he becomes so emotionally distressed during the argument on the boat leading to Dickie's murder. After he kills Dickie, Damon's Tom seems genuinely distraught by what he's done, even falling asleep with Dickie's corpse as he cradles it. This is in stark contrast to both book Tom, who wastes no time after committing the act before trying to figure out his next move, and Scott's Tom, who unsentimentally steals any of Dickie's valuables he can find after he's dead. But just in case there were still any doubts about movie Tom's sexuality, the film goes even further by having him develop a rather explicitly romantic relationship with Peter Smith Kingsley, a minor character from the book who isn't even in the Netflix version. In the book, Peter is someone whose acquaintance Tom makes in Venice, but in the film he's reimagined as a friend of Marge's who is introduced to Tom in Rome, and quickly takes a liking to him, which Tom reciprocates. They become closer over the course of the movie, and have more or less become lovers by the time Dickie's death is ruled a suicide. We aren't explicitly told about the nature of their relationship, but like, come on. However, their bliss is cut short on a boat to Greece, where Tom runs into Meredith Logue, a character invented for the movie whom he'd previously encountered while impersonating Dickie, and who also happens to be acquainted with Peter. Backed into a corner, a heartbroken Tom kills Peter and disposes of his body to prevent his lies from being exposed. He sobs while doing this, showing that he truly does love Peter and is motivated not just by self-preservation, but perhaps fear that Peter will see him as a monster when he discovers the truth of what he's done. This highlights the different characterization of Damon's Tom as a more tragic figure than either his book counterpart, who doesn't exactly enjoy killing people but also isn't one to shed tears over it, or the Netflix version, who barely shows any emotion at all when he commits murder.
Everybody should have one talent. What's yours?
Our next character is Dickie Greenleaf, who's basically a walking catalyst for the events of the story. As I've established, he's the son of a wealthy shipping magnate and has no interest in joining the family business, so he's moved to Italy to shirk his responsibilities and focus more on his art. In both the book and the series, he's a terrible amateur painter, whereas in the movie his interests are more musical. Highsmith's Dickie is a charming and charismatic young man, but one who resists the call of maturity at every turn. Tom is in awe of his hedonistic lifestyle and the adoration that he commands from those around him, but he also recognizes that this is a man who's lived a much more sheltered life than he has, and he even looks down on him in some ways, even as he envies him. In Minghella's film, Dickie is played by Jude Law as something of an airheaded frat bro, the playboy aspect of his character dialed up considerably. This is a Dickie who likes to party, an overgrown child seemingly incapable of taking anything seriously. Law imbues him with such carefree charm that it's not at all hard to see why other characters would be drawn to him, though his less attractive traits become more apparent during the first half of the film. Movie Dickie's relationship with the Marge character is a little more explicitly romantic than in other versions, but he's also revealed to be cheating on her with another woman, whom he refuses to help when she gets pregnant, leading to her suicide. His cruelty towards Tom as their relationship sours is also more pronounced than it was in the book. Book Dickie simply becomes more cold towards Tom, who in turn senses that he's become put off by him. But movie Dickie makes insensitive jabs that hurt Tom's feelings and is actively nasty to him during the boat scene. To movie Dickie, Tom was just another yes man that he could have follow him around and look up to him, and once he becomes tired of him, he callously discards him. Johnny Flynn's portrayal of Dickie in the Netflix series is once again a little closer to the book. His Dickie enjoys a somewhat quieter lifestyle than Law's, still content to live hedonistically for the foreseeable future, but with less party animal abandon and more blasé rich kid energy. He's also generally more likable. In one scene pulled from the book, he assists a young woman by helping her get a cab home. The show expands on this by including an exchange where Tom tells Dickie that the woman was most likely scamming him, something that strikes Tom as obvious and highlights the contrast between his inherently suspicious nature and Dickie's sheltered naivete. Both versions of Dickie are immature young men, but in Law's case this manifests through his disregard for any kind of responsibility, and in Flynn's case through his shallow attempts to appear worldly when he's known nothing but comfort his whole life. Let's look again at the scene on the boat. Law's Dickie bluntly tells Tom that he's a leech and he wants him gone, but Flynn goes too far in the opposite direction by trying to avoid confrontation altogether, instead spinning a half-assed spiel about how Tom should try and see more of Italy while he and Marge spend more time alone together. He may not be as outwardly insensitive as the movie version, but he's still a weak-willed man who doesn't know how to deal with difficult situations and can't recognize red flags until it's too late.
A trolley is like a place in a dream that becomes even more dreamlike when you wake.
In my plot synopsis earlier, I referred to the character of Marge as Dickie's sort of girlfriend. That's because the extent to which their relationship is mutually romantic differs from version to version, but the one constant is that Marge is in love with Dickie and she spends a substantial amount of the story being gaslit by Tom following Dickie's disappearance. Her arc plays out more or less the same way in the book and the series. From the beginning, there's a lot of tension between her and Tom, as she views him as a leech taking advantage of Dickie. When Tom steals Dickie's identity, he writes Marge a series of letters trying to give her the impression that Dickie is deliberately avoiding her, mainly so that she'll never discover the truth, but also partly out of spite because he's never liked her to begin with. When Tom is living by his own name in Venice, Marge comes by and stays with him for a while, determined to figure out what's really going on with Dickie. It seems like she's about to discover the truth when she comes across Dickie's rings, which he had always sworn he'd never take off, among Tom's belongings. Luckily for Tom, though, the conclusion she draws from this is that Dickie must have given Tom the rings because he was going to kill himself. By the end, she's come to trust Tom and moves on with her life now that she has a false sense of closure. All of this is adapted rather faithfully in the show, where Marge is played to icy perfection by Dakota Fanning. In an interview with British Vogue, Fanning observed that while her character of Marge clearly does care for Dickie, she's also something of an ambitious opportunist herself, using her closeness with Dickie to further her own interests in a way that actually makes her not too dissimilar to Tom, which only adds to their mutual disdain for one another. It's interesting to note that Marge is particularly cold towards Tom when she perceives him as a threat to her lifestyle, but when Dickie is out of her life and Tom is living comfortably in Venice, she becomes more friendly towards him, as he offers her something of a return to that high society life. In the movie, Marge's arc plays out essentially in reverse to how it does in the book. Played here by Gwyneth Paltrow, Marge is a lot warmer than her book counterpart, and there's certainly no sense that she has even the slightest ulterior motives to being with Dickie. She's totally welcoming to Tom, treating him as a friend, showing concern for his well-being, and expressing her fondness for him to Dickie in private. This is in stark contrast to the book, where her letters make her disdain for Tom quite clear. Tom's attitude towards her is also markedly different, at least at first. Book Tom almost immediately sees Marge as coming between himself and Dickie, whereas movie Tom initially harbors no real resentment towards her. That is, until he spots her and Dickie having sex in the cabin of his boat, and later learns of Dickie's intent to marry her. Following Dickie's disappearance, Marge becomes increasingly frustrated by how he's seemingly avoiding her, especially after he becomes a suspect in Freddy's murder. Her discovery of the rings still happens here, but it plays out very differently. Marge immediately becomes suspicious of Tom when she finds the rings, and his rambling attempts to explain himself only further convince her of the truth. The only thing that prevents Tom from killing her is the sudden entrance of Peter. By the end of the movie, Marge is the only person who's figured out that Tom killed Dickie, but everyone else has fallen under his spell and assumed that she's simply in grief-induced denial. We last see her being pulled away by Dickie's father as she tearfully screams at Tom that she knows what he did, certain of the truth, but unable to prove it. In all versions of the story, Marge is a classic victim of gaslighting, but Paltrow's version is arguably a more innocent and tragic character than either of the other versions I'm talking about here.
Tommy? It's a pay thing.
Freddy Miles is one of Dickie's rich friends, a smarmy and snobbish self-styled playwright whom Tom takes an immediate disliking to in all versions, and the feeling is assuredly mutual. While Dickie welcomes Tom into his social circle, Freddy serves as a reminder that he's very much an outsider in this crowd. When he threatens to expose Tom while he's living as Dickie in Rome, Tom murders him and is sent down a path of even more lies and cover-ups. The characterization of Freddy might be the biggest change from the movie to the show. Movie Freddy is played by the late great Philip Seymour Hoffman as pretty much the embodiment of the ugly American stereotype. A brash, obnoxious socialite who always makes himself the center of attention. In the Netflix show, Freddy is played by Elliot Sumner, whose take on the character is much more reserved than Hoffman's. They play Freddy as more of a quietly stuck-up English aristocrat, the ultimate posh, self-important boarding school kid who's also a little sharper than either the book or movie version of the character, while still being a pompous asshole. I saw a few people criticizing Sumner as miscast, but I really thought that their take on the character was exactly what this version needed. Something completely different from Hoffman's also excellent performance while still capturing the essence of Highsmith's character, just in a new way. But there's another interesting change that I think makes Sumner's casting more interesting and subversive than detractors are giving Steve Zaillian credit for. In the book, Freddy's hostility towards Tom carries a certain homophobic undertone, with Tom himself pegging Freddy as the kind of guy who'd beat somebody up if he expected them of sexual deviation, i.e. queerness. That's definitely visible in Hoffman's portrayal. His Freddy is aggressively heterosexual from the moment we meet him.
God, don't you want to fuck everyone you see just once?
And seems constantly on the verge of calling Tom the F-slur. Now let's look at Sumner's portrayal again. Sumner himself is non-binary, and their take on Freddy is an androgynous twink who reads as queer himself. For clarity, I'm using masculine pronouns for the character, not the actor. This adds a different dimension to his first interaction with Tom. Rather than a sneering homophobe, Freddy comes across as a fellow queer who is instinctively able to clock something in Tom that initially goes over Dickie's head. Notably, Sumner's Freddy thinks he remembers meeting Tom at the apartment of a Bob Delancey. This character doesn't appear in the show, but in the book he's Tom's roommate and he's heavily implied to be gay. And then of course, after Freddy dies, the police go up to his hotel room and find another man sleeping in his bed. Later, when the police are questioning Tom about Freddy's death, he really emphasizes Freddy's sexuality, trying to paint a picture of him as a promiscuous deviant who is prone to debauchery in the hopes that this will make the police write off his killing as a random tryst gone wrong. After all, the show is set in the not exactly queer-friendly 1960s. Whether you prefer Anthony Minghella's The Talented Mr. Ripley or Steve Zaillian's Ripley, they make for fascinating companion pieces. One makes a number of changes in translating the source material to the cinematic medium, the other is able to be more faithful but still adds its own, perhaps more modern flavour. One is a lush late 90s prestige drama, the other a chilly character study. And central to the two adaptations' approach to the material is the casting and portrayals of the core players, each version bringing its own layers to Highsmith's already fascinating characters that enrich them not just as adaptations, but as standalone works.